Page 33. I'm writing it for you now, so you can memorize it. If you've had something ripped away, if you've been knocked down, get back up. Every time. Thanks, Chumbawamba. What's up, my fellow small business supporters? It's Savvy, your gay aunt from the 80s, and today we are reviewing another one of Rachel Hollis's books. Today we are going to review not Girl Wash Your Ass, not Girl Stop Plagiarizing, but Rachel Hollis's newest book called Didn't See My Divorce Coming. The story of how I scammed tons of my fans for $2,000 to get my unlicensed marriage counseling. Didn't see your mom coming. The story of sexual repression in Southern housewives of the baby boomer generation. No, we are reading Didn't See That Coming, Putting Life Back Together When Your World Falls Apart. I liked my titles better.
Get you some nuts.
There was lots of memes.
Makes me wonder if I should pick up lesbianism.
Chicago.
You guys asked for it.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome to my channel for the first time. I'm Savvy, welcome to Savvy Writes Books. On this channel, we review books, we talk about my life as an author, we talk about my life as a small business owner, and we roast some business scammers. Whenever Rachel Hollis releases a new book, I get to do all of those things at once, and it's just beautiful. If this is your first time on my channel, please don't forget to click the subscribe button, because every Monday and Friday at 11 a.m. Central, I have new videos coming out about books, writing, and small business owner life, and every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Central, I host the AuthorTube Sleepover, where a bunch of authors get together, wear our pajamas, write, have a party, it's great. And every Friday at 12:30 Central, 1:30 p.m. Eastern, which is going to be pretty much right after this video premiere, I live stream with my friend RK Gold while we work on writing our novel together, one that we're co-writing called Cancel Sean Boston, all about, you know, a new adult romantic comedy for the socially distanced internet drama age. I hope you guys enjoy it. Come on into our live stream if you want to see that happen in front of your eyes. Today, we have got so much to talk about with this review, but before we get super deep into it, I just wanted to say today's video was brought to you by my Patreon supporters. Their names are up here on the screen, and they are also linked in the description below. All of my top tier patrons, that's people who are $5 a month and up, have their online store or their own YouTube channel or their website or their social media linked as well, so please check out all of them. They're awesome small business supporters, and so make sure you support them as small business owners also. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your support as I continue to make these types of videos. Oh, I love when I get my purple gay aunt from the 80s lipstick on the coffee mug. So when it comes to reviewing Didn't See That Coming by Rachel Hollis, I have a lot more to talk about than the standard stuff I talk about when I review books. A lot of you have probably seen I have my indie book reviewing system, which I have now kind of applied to traditionally published or Big Five publishing house books as well. I'm not really going to go through that system for this because there's just so much to talk about with so many different sections. I'm going to have multiple parts of this video where we talk about multiple different elements in this book, but first, I just want to talk about the first thing that made me mad in this book. Guys, I got mad at this book before the book even started. So we open up the book, right? Okay, there's a blank page. There's the title page. There's the title of the book. Right here. This is the page I got mad on. I put my first post-it on this page before we even got to the copyright page. I was already mad because this page is the page where it's like, books also by this author, right? I put those in my books too. So Rachel has this page that says also by Rachel Hollis. And what does she list? Girl, wash your face. Girl, stop apologizing. Now, if you've been following Rachel for a little while, you probably see no problem with that because you're like, yeah, those are her other two books. But if you're me, you have a big problem with that. I will link up in the cards the huge video essay that I did. It's like 45 minutes long where I delved into Rachel's life and reviewed her books that she wrote before she was the self-help guru, before she was the business guru scammer person, back when she was just her own creative person, her own legitimate small business owner, when she was basically what I am now 10 years ago, because Rachel is just me but 10 years older. We've talked about this. Yeah, back when she was that person, I reviewed her books from back then. Because before she wrote that book, she wrote the entire Party Girl series. Where is Party Girl listed on here? Party Girl, Sweet Girl, and Smart Girl. I reviewed those books in my video essay. Guess what? I liked them. I thought it was cool back in the day when Rachel Hollis was like me, a self-published indie women's fiction author, just doing her thing, getting her story out there, having genuine creative passion for her work instead of trying to pander to an audience of people who need motivation. Where are those books? So I wrote here, she's distancing herself from her best work. And that makes me sad because part of me, I've always held on to this hope that because she is a creative person, she's a writer, she's a public speaker, and she's got all of these really strong skills that she could be using them, but she's not because she's clearly distancing herself from it because she's not even listing them in her book. In the video I posted last week where I reviewed the book Authorpreneur, where I talked about how I have this fear that the author world could go down a multi-level marketing or MLM or pyramid scheme type of structure in the future. Things like that are what scares me when somebody decides that they're going to distance themselves from their most honest and most truly passionate work and instead pretend it never existed in favor of only showing the work that made them the most money. It makes me sad. It just does, as an author myself. So the first section of this review I'm going to call The Frame, which is Rachel's chapter called I Call Bullshit.
This is bullshit.
This is a chapter that she puts in this book before she really delves into each. So this book is kind of organized into what to do today, what to do tomorrow, and what to do forever. Before any of that, she has a chapter called I Call Bullshit. I liked the title of this chapter a lot. I was glad to see Rachel, starting to swear a little bit, not censoring herself so much, not holding back quite as much as she used to, especially on page 8 where she's just like, it's the fucking worst. I'm like, yeah, Rachel, it is the fucking worst. But then part of me is always skeptical, like, is this really real? Or is now that she had her divorce and lost a large segment of her more like culturally conservative audience, is she just like, okay, well, now that I'm appealing to more of the feminist girl power audience, I need to be more open and start swearing? Like, I can't tell. Since you're starting off this book by being like, here are the things I'm calling bullshit on, I've decided that I can call bullshit whenever I want to within your book as well. So let's see where we end up calling bullshit in this. Let's delve into the area that, as an author, I feel the most qualified to talk on within this book, the writing itself. I do think Rachel is a good writer. I've brought this up before, especially when I was reviewing her indie women's fiction that she seems to want to pretend doesn't exist now, even though it was her best work in my opinion. There's a lot of problems in the writing in this book. When I did the video like last month where I took Rachel's free course, that was the gift that came along with this book, I reacted to when she explained the process of how this book was published, about how this book was published really quickly, about how when the pandemic hit, she was basically like, you know what, I'm gonna write this book right now and get it out for September. So basically, like, she was writing it in March, she got it out in September. This book was like 6 months, right? This was like, boom. For this publisher, Day Street Books, which is a division of HarperCollins, so it is part of a Big Five publishing corporation. Because of that, that is really fast to get a book out for one of those major corporations, because they have, an editorial calendar that is planned out much farther in advance, versus people like me who are in the indie community tend to release books faster anyway. I've already released 2 books in the year of 2020, and I have a 3rd one coming out in November. But within the indie community, we have something that works even faster than I do, which is called rapid release. Rapid release is generally for genre fiction such as romance, horror, mystery, thriller, erotica, things like that, where there is generally a lot of genre conventions and a lot of tropes that writers can fall back on, but that doesn't make the work any less good because that's what the readers are seeking that genre for. So a lot of people who do that do rapid release, meaning they release probably 4 to 6 books a year. A lot of the time it's a book every 2 months to every 3 or 4 months. They're just coming out constantly. And so that means people are writing quickly, and now they're staggering them. So it's not like they wrote, edited, and released it within those 2 months. They are writing the next one while another one's in editing, if that makes sense. Still, it's a very quick process. It's a very quick turnover. So what Rachel did with this book was quick, but knowing how many people I know that do that full time for their job, and this whole industry that's built on rapid release and putting things out quickly, I don't think the fact that it came out quickly is an excuse for the poor writing, for the bad editing, and for just the mistakes that are in this book. I'm not usually someone who cares that much about typos. I'm like, okay, a typo, whatever, if it didn't take me out of the story that much. But it's this thing where within the publishing industry, there still is a kind of hierarchy where people who are part of the big 5 publishing corporations that control most of the industry seem to think that, you know, their industry is the gold standard. They are the best you can do. And that mindset kind of makes it difficult on small business owners to enter the game. But that's an argument that's often made. Well, oh, if anyone can just publish a book, then you could get a book that's riddled with typos and is super gross. And books like this prove to me what I've been saying, which is that society has progressed beyond the need for big 5 publishing corporations controlling the industry, because there's a lot of shit in this. We're going to start with page 12. On page 12, Rachel does something which I see her doing multiple times throughout this book, which is that she basically has no transition between her sentences, calls out the fact that she's shitty at writing transitions, and instead of like her editor being like, okay, I know you're trying to make a joke, but it's not funny, so how about instead you just take that out and we'll work on writing a good transition. Since the book was rushed, instead it's kind of like she's just gonna be a little meta and make fun of herself, which might be funny once or twice. Here it doesn't work. So for example, Rachel has just finished telling the story about the bathroom paint. If you watch my video where I took her course and reviewed it as I was taking it, you remember the bathroom paint story, but if you don't, it was basically it was a hypothetical situation where it's like, imagine if you bought a new home and the bathroom paint was it was a really gross color, and you wanted to repaint that room. So you went and you got a new shade of paint that you liked better and you painted over it. You were sitting in the bathtub and you noticed the gross old paint cover bubbling and creeping through the walls and coming back. And she's like, oh, because if the original paint was high gloss, you actually needed to sand it down and put a primer over it first. So the metaphor was basically that, like, if you are going through a difficult time in your life, if you just try to paint over it, the bad stuff will still come back out, as opposed to like, you have to address that stuff first, if that makes sense. I don't think it's a very good analogy just because like it takes so long to get to the point. But of course she just tells the same exact story again in this book because her free course was a fucking joke. It was basically just her reusing content that was already in this book and just saying it out loud instead of writing it in the book. I shouldn't be surprised that the free course was basically a scam. But anyway, so she just finishes telling that story once again. And then she says, what does any of this have to do with what you're currently living with? Nothing at all. The paint has nothing at all to do with what you're going through. But it's a perfect illustration for you trying to pretend that you don't have negative, ugly feelings about what's happening when you do. She could have crafted a much more interesting transition there. And, you know, after talking about the paint story, she could have launched into a comparison. Like, she's a good writer. She knows how to use language to her advantage. Now imagine that layer of gross paint is the gross feelings that you have inside, or the gross pit in your stomach that you feel when you still think about the tragedy that's going with you. The pretty glossy paint is the way that you want to feel, but if you put the way you want to feel over the way you already feel without sanding down and getting rid of those gross feelings first, it's still gonna bubble back out of you. And there could be so much more imagery there with her drawing that direct comparison, instead of having to insert this awkward transition in there going, what does this have to do with what you're living with? Nothing. It has nothing. Like, why does she need to say that? It's clunky, it's extra wordy, and it takes away from the power that the analogy could potentially have. And I think it's weird that her editor didn't catch that. Now, when Rachel does these like little self-aware inserts every once in a while, they have been done well. For example, when I reviewed Girl Stop Apologizing, which overall I hated, it was the worst book I read in 2019. Side note, this is not the worst book I read in 2020. That's Grant Cardone's Be Obsessed or Be Average. Worst book of 2020, I couldn't finish it. In Girl Stop Apologizing, she had this part where she was like, she had a quote from Jay-Z where it said, "I'm a hustler, baby," at the top of the chapter as like an epigraph. And then underneath that, when she started writing, she started with, "Don't you hate it when an author starts a chapter with a quote?" And then she used that to lead into the point she was making. And I thought that was funny and done really well. In here, the whole like meta self-aware critiquing myself, this really has nothing to do with it kind of thing, it's not funny. It just takes you out of the story and makes you more confused when the analogy was already really verbose and like extra in the first place. I hope that makes sense. The next place that I think she really struggled with writing or trying to make an extended metaphor or an analogy work was on page 31. She's doing this section where she's breaking down what an identity crisis means. And she breaks it down into like, okay, what if you had an identity that was taken away from you, such as you identified as a great employee, but you got laid off. So now your identity was taken away from you. So she breaks down different types of having an identity crisis. And then she decides she wants to do another analogy. So on page 31, at the top of the page, she says, for a more visual illustration, let me try using a subject I know almost nothing about, basketball. So I assumed that after that, she might be like, in basketball, here is how a certain identity might work compared to, or like something within the game or something. She says nothing about basketball after that until... Oh, she doesn't say it again until 5 pages later on page 36. She says, like, third identity crisis that many people find themselves in, particularly as they begin to evolve. You chose an identity for yourself that you no longer want, or in basketball terms, again, you're wearing a uniform that no longer fits. And I'm like, again, I might have missed something, but I read through this section like 5 times trying to be like, did I miss the actual basketball analogy? Because she just said, let me try, for a more visual illustration, let's use a subject I know nothing about, basketball. And then instantly after that, she's like, for the first one, you know, several years back, I was speaking at a Navy SEAL Foundation. And then she talks about a speech she gave at the Navy SEAL Foundation immediately after and never mentions basketball. And I'm wondering if, like, she wrote that section because she was doing this so quickly. If she, like, wrote that section and then was like, okay, I'm gonna tie in the basketball thing. Okay, let me write out the Navy SEAL example first, and then I'll come back in and tie it into basketball, and then just forgot to. And, like, maybe her editor just didn't catch that. So in this part, I'm like, if I were your editor, I would be like, what the fuck is that? I was so confused. And then finally, on page 160, there was a spelling error that changed the meaning of the sentence, which is a problem. Because, like, Rachel, where was your editor for this? She was talking about the process of adoption and adopting a baby. You're meeting with the birth parents. You might be so excited about meeting the new baby that you forget to consider the feelings of the birth parents. And it was actually a good point, and I think it made a lot of sense, and I'm glad she brought it up. But the way she wrote this was, the excited prospective parents are laser focused on the baby. And I was like, so I was already lost because I was like, at first I was like, the excited perspective. So I'm like, okay, she's talking about the parents have a perspective that is excited. So they're like the excited prospective parents, and I assume the rest of the sentence would be like, the excited prospective parents will exhibit during this time, might cloud their judgment or something. But she didn't. She said the excited prospective parents are laser focused on the baby. And then it hit me that she meant the word prospective. She just spelled it wrong. It was supposed to be prospective parents, not perspective parents. So she was like, perspective is a noun. So I thought she was talking about the excited perspective that parents had, but she was talking about the excited prospective parents. So she was using that as an adjective to describe parents. So the construction of the sentence was completely different. So she's saying the excited prospective parents are laser focused on the baby. So that was just describing the parents. The excited prospective parents was supposed to be the entire subject clause of the sentence. Beyond the writing itself, I think the first major content analysis we need to do on this book is the way that this book pushes the concept of toxic positivity and commodified motivation. Now, I've done a lot of videos on toxic positivity already. It's basically this idea that, like, you need to stay positive no matter what. But this book goes beyond that because not every section of this was toxically positive. There were a lot of areas that were like, you do need to address your grief. You can admit that it sucks. You can admit that it fucking sucks. Let Rachel say fuck 2020. How about that? There was something I want to talk about called commodified motivation. And this is a topic I'm not going to go super deep into because I'm actually planning a bigger video on this topic. I'm right now reading and working on a review for the book Bright-Sided by Barbara Ehrenreich, which is a great book, and it's a book about how the toxic positivity movement and how the movement towards positive thinking at all costs has actually undermined a lot of things within our culture and our country and things like that. And there's just a lot to it, but she goes into kind of the history of how motivation became became a product to be sold. And so that is what I'm going to be calling commodified motivation in this. The idea that a lot of this is a packaged bit of motivation to sell to another person. So let's start with page 195 called Reimagine Your Future. So this whole chapter was in the course. If you guys remember when I took the free course, this whole chapter was just in the course. So there was nothing in the course really that wasn't in the book. So it was a useless free gift. It was just a preview for what you already bought, which sucks. But this is one of the chapters that I think promoted toxic positivity the most. On page 200, she has a section called Make a Conscious Decision to Rebuild. And in here she says, when we come through a crisis, we are forced to build new foundations. The gift in this, yes, I said gift, is that you are able to rebuild. And in doing so, you get to decide what is a must in your life and what you need to let go of. And so it's kind of like the reframing of like, oh, this is a gift. We also see this on page 164 in her chapter called Be Surprised by Resilience. In this section, she starts it off with a very cliche Pinterest style quote that says, look at your scars, not your open wounds. She has her signature cliche line of toxic positivity in this, the one that she stole from Tony Robbins, to you and for you. Y'all remember to you and for you? In her Made for More documentary, she kept talking about to you and for you, and I was like, but what about 3u? What if we took the average of 2u and 4u? What if u is a variable and we did 2u plus 4u equals 6u? So if we divide it by 2, on average, that is 3u. Life Happens 3u merch, link in the description below. Oftentimes when I teach about the idea that this hardship can be for you instead of something that's happening to you, people will try and mine their current hardships for lessons. Okay, so she's talking about, let's see how can your hardship work for you instead of to you. And I wrote right here, like, Rachel, you just cannot stop with the to you and for you. Oh, and down here I wrote 3u merch link in bio. But she just could not resist. She could not resist to you and for you. And then on page 170, she says the following. I don't want to motivate you. Rachel, have I just become your latest target? Did you plagiarize me? Hold on, friends. This book is not going to motivate you. The first line of my back cover copy of #SavvyBusinessOwner, the book that specifically says at the bottom, if you hated Girl Stop Apologizing, you'll love #SavvyBusinessOwner. In my book about how to start a small business full of specific advice of things that helped me along the way, link in description below if you're interested in this book, about how I built the Forever Home Friends and all of that. The first line, this book is not going to motivate you. And here's the thing, I stayed true to my word. This book was not, I had no like motivational you can do it platitudes or Pinterest quotes in this. I had like, here's how I raised money. Here's how I used crowdfunding. Here's my best tips. Here's some resources I'd recommend. I don't want to motivate you. Now, I'm not saying, guys, let me be clear. I don't think Rachel actually tried to plagiarize me. I think that that is incredibly unlikely. The sentence, I don't want to motivate you, is something that she could have very well thought up on her own independent, and I'm pretty sure she doesn't know about me, although... Anyway, the entire discussion of Rachel's toxic positivity and commodified motivation leads into a bigger discussion of this book, which is the fact that it is full of out-of-touch moments. Now, I first realized Rachel was out of touch when I read Girl Wash Your Face, and in that review, when I did that review video way back in 2018, I talked about how Rachel was out of touch when she mentioned that, like, oh, the reason that people must admire my life and want to be like me is that I'm always so grateful for things, that I'm always smiling and positive. And it's like, no, it's because you're rich as fuck. She tries to imagine what her audience thinks of her. And because she's been, like, I've mentioned this before, I know that Rachel grew up in a lower middle class background. I know that she didn't come from, like, a wealthy family or a family with big connections, and I admire her for that. I've always said that. But I think that maybe now that she's been in this world of hyper success for so long, that she's kind of lost touch with what most people actually think about things. So we'll start with page 2, which says... I wrote the first draft as a sort of Sherpa, believing I could help guide you over the mountain of grief. Now I find myself back inside grief and editing from an entirely different perspective than the one from which I wrote. I'm no longer a Sherpa leading from the front. Now I'm also trudging through it with you. So what I wrote in this section was when she said, I'm no longer a Sherpa, I wrote, you never were. That is like, and first of all, we can talk about how the line about how she used to think she was a Sherpa, that was also in the course. Like, the course video that I took is so much of it was like she was already in the book. Like, there was nothing new offered there. So that was a shitty incentive. Anyone who pre-ordered the book early to get the course, let me know if you thought the same thing. But it's just so self-aggrandizing to be like, I saw myself as a Sherpa. Because then also in the course she talked about like how she saw herself as an authority on overcoming grief. When it's like, you are not an authority. People who study psychology and grief counseling and got licensed in those fields are experts. I mentioned this, like, living through pain does not make you an expert in how to overcome pain. I live through pain with my scoliosis. It doesn't make me a spinal surgeon. Does that make sense? Mental health is just as much of a medical field as health in other parts of your body. Your brain is part of your body. And even later in this book, I'll talk about when I talk about what I think she did well. She does mention some actual cited, legitimately researched things about the brain, which I thought was great, but I don't understand why she's so dismissive of the profession of mental health. She does say to go to a therapist and that kind of thing, but why is she so dismissive as to think that she is an expert on par with the therapist when in reality she's not a therapist any more than I'm a doctor for my spine problems, if that makes sense. She had the next big out of touch moment that I recognized on page 13 when she said, when the world basically shut down in the spring of 2020 due to the pandemic, there was so much disappointment and grief, but there was also a weird comparison of misfortune going on that made nearly everyone I know feel like their disappointment was petty and small. It wasn't petty and small. It matters that you're disappointed because you matter. Now, I don't have a problem with what she said there. What she said directly there was true. I have a problem with it in context of what she said when the pandemic first started. So if you guys remember, when the pandemic first started going, she moved her RISE conference to be virtual, to be online. I didn't attend it, but I saw some clips from it online and things like that people had shared with me. One of the things she said during the RISE conference was that the pandemic wasn't hard. Like, that was a direct quote. She was like, you think the pandemic and the quarantine is hard? What you're going through right now is not hard. Like, she said that as like a motivational thing to be like, you can handle much more than this. It's not, but it's like she was basically diminishing the fact that for a lot of people who had contracted the disease or who had a family member who was suffering with it or who didn't have good health coverage or whose business was dying due to places being closed down, so many things that were destroying so many lives that it was the hardest thing a lot of people had gone through. Even if, like, she even said, like, I've gone through legitimately hard stuff in my life. And she has. She even details it in this book, which I will talk about, and I think she did a good job of that. But she also kind of engaged in the pain comparison, which she's saying here is a bad idea, when she said, like, you know, I've gone through things that are hard. This isn't hard. Like, maybe for you it's not hard. But for a lot of people, even people that have gone through the most difficult things you could imagine, due to how big of a thing this was for them, this could still be the hardest thing they've ever experienced. So I thought that was incredibly out of touch too. Rachel's out of touch moments are often balanced with her moments of trying to appear like she's relatable, but utterly failing to. And that's what leads us into our next section of the review of this book, which is Rachel's curated imperfection. Throughout this book, she has so many stories where she really tries to appear relatable. And that's not surprising. Her entire persona was built up on, I'm exactly like you, but she has to still show herself as better because otherwise, what would you be striving for if she's already identical to you? On page 16, that's where I saw one of the first examples of her use of curated imperfection to show an inaccurate portrayal of her. I still don't like tuna canned in oil, but I've eaten it twice this week because all your capital T truths and must-haves were really only ever preferences. Rachel, you're rich as hell. Why are you eating canned tuna if you don't want it? And that's the thing where I was like, I call bullshit.
This is bullshit.
We're still in the I call bullshit chapter right now. We're in the I call bullshit chapter. I'm like, I call bullshit. Hit the bullshit button. Rachel, stop pretending to be poor. It's the thing I talked about when I did that video about how Rachel Hollis and Shane Dawson, the YouTuber, the two of them actually had a lot of parallels and similarities in their use of curated imperfection. And real quick, because I cite my sources, I would be remiss if I did not mention that the term curated imperfection was coined by Laura Turner, a writer for BuzzFeed News, in her initial in-depth review of Girl Wash Your Face. And she defined curated imperfection as the idea of showing specific flaws of yourself, showing yourself as being flawed enough for your audience to be able to relate to you, but still having a very curated image of that where you specifically select which flaws you want to show to the world. And to an extent, we all select which flaws we want to show to the world, but with Rachel, there is a very key component that makes that imperfection curated, which I'm going to delve into in just a minute. But first of all, it's like, Rachel, why are you pretending to be poor? If you don't like canned tuna, don't eat canned tuna. You run a company that brings in millions of dollars. Girl, buy yourself something else to eat. And that was the same thing we would see with Shane Dawson, right? Where he grew up poor and pretended to still be poor once he got rich and famous as a way to kind of deflect criticism and to make himself appear like he's just like the rest of us. Rachel is doing the exact same thing here. Another place we saw one of these relatable stories was on pages 17 and 19, where she starts talking about being a stoner. So she says, I don't do drugs, but damn, did I wish I was a stoner during March of 2020. So then on the next page she says, in my weaker moments, I did wish I could be a hippie living somewhere on a commune wearing maxi dresses and never brushing my hair and smoking so much reefer that I didn't worry about what would happen to our friends and families and how much this would devastate our hospitals and our economy. Like, that's dramatic as shit, okay? If you start smoking weed, you are not instantly gonna turn into a hippie who just like walks around in a huge floral dress and lives in a commune with 100 other people. Like that's like some like high school health class level fear mongering. Like, oh, I wish I could just like, no, Rachel, if you want to smoke some weed, just smoke some weed. It's not that big of a deal. You can still be the same person you are now. It's really not that huge of a deal. Whenever someone says reefer, that makes me think of the movie Reefer Madness, where, you know, the movie where it was like, oh my god, smoking weed is gonna turn everybody into like these crazy demons, and like, no, dude, no. Then on page 21, she said, I baked a chocolate cake and licked the icing off the mixer attachments and never once worried about the calories. And I was like, Pam is proud of you. Pam is proud, Rachel. You know what? Pam and I will bake a box cake in solidarity. Throughout this book, I imagine to appear relatable. I don't know to whom. To me, perhaps. Rachel sprinkled in a few Star Trek references, which were weirdly inaccurate. So I'm like, Rachel, how many of your fans are diehard Star Trek fans? Just me? On page 29, she says, it's like one of those sci-fi movies where the spaceship moves into hyperdrive or warp speed or whatever they call it, and the galaxies all blur into streaks, and suddenly the Enterprise is in another dimension. And I was like, that's called Star Trek? Maybe you could cite your source? Not a huge deal, though. That's not plagiarism or anything. But also, like, Star Trek is not one of those sci-fi movies. Star Trek is multiple TV series. It's a huge franchise with a series that started in 1966. On my birthday, actually. I share a birthday with Star Trek and with Bernie Sanders. Interesting. Anyway, so Star Trek was a series that started in 1966 and then had multiple series come after it, and there were some movies, but the Star Trek TV shows way outweigh the movies, so it was one of those sci-fi movies. Like, which one? Which one, Rachel? But then I got really mad on page 76 when the weird Star Trek references hit the next level. So she said right here, remember that you can have bad thoughts and still be a good person. I would just like to take this moment to remind you that having petty, small-minded, rude, impractical, greedy, selfish thoughts doesn't make you a bad person. I've thought about Star Trek before. That doesn't make me a Klingon. First of all, there's a comma splice in that sentence. I forgot to bring that up in the bad editing section. If you say, so I've thought about Star Trek before, and that doesn't make me a Klingon, are two independent clauses. If you want to connect two independent clauses, you either need to use a coordinating conjunction, or you need to use a semicolon or a period. You can make them two separate sentences, but you can't just conjoin them with a comma and nothing else. So she could say, I thought about Star Trek before, but that doesn't make me a Klingon, and that would be fine. Or she could have put a semicolon instead of a comma there. But once again, this book was not edited properly. It was rushed, and it shows. But beyond that, beyond the comma, that's not how Klingons work, Rachel. Rachel's acting like over here, like the Klingons are the bad guys. I'm like, okay, maybe if you watch Star Trek the original series, you thought the Klingons were the bad guys. But if Star Trek the original series is what you watch, then you need not be referring to it as one of those sci-fi movies, right? Like that's two separate things. If you are a Star Trek the original series fan. Once you get to Star Trek The Next Generation, by that time, the Klingons are allies to Earth within the Federation. They're allies. Klingons are good guys, dude. And, like, sure, they're not perfect all the time, but, like, they're good guys overall. Like, they're not the enemy. The enemies are, well, the Romulans, they have, like, an on and off kind of thing, but then there's, like, the Cardassians. Those are, like, the really bad guys. And then, like, in the Next Generation, they had the Ferengi, who were, like, considered kind of bad guys. But then by the time you got to Deep Space Nine, the Ferengis were working along with the Earth, and they were being good guys as well. So that's kind of the point of Star Trek, is like there's no fully good guys or bad guys at any time. Like everyone eventually learns to work through things. It's a very optimistic look at the future, and I love it. But anyway, in the Next Generation, Worf is working on the Enterprise. He's a Klingon, and he actually is adopted by Earth parents. So I'm like, okay, what are you all about with this? Like, I've had bad thoughts and it doesn't make me a bad person. I've thought about Star Trek, doesn't make me a Klingon. That seems to be a direct parallel to being like, first of all, I don't believe you've ever thought about Star Trek, because you referred to it as one of those sci-fi movies. And also, if you ever really thought about it, you would not still think the Klingons are bad guys. That's all I'm saying, Rachel. And I don't know if that was targeted at me to be like, see, Savvy, I'm reaching across the aisle to you and your weird Star Trek ass. I have a tattoo in Klingon on my foot. I've talked about that in the past. Now let's move on to an actual example of some curated imperfection that I liked at first, because in terms of my humor maturity, I'm basically 12 years old and still, like, I haven't progressed beyond, like, butts are funny, which they are, dude. Butts are hilarious. But in this section, Rachel was talking about her nasty farts and her nasty poop. So I think this is funny. I'm gonna read this section because I, like, burst out laughing at how funny I thought this was. But we're also going to talk about how this story is really meaningless, even though I think it's hilarious. So Rachel's like, I'm gonna read this dramatically. It was dark out, and I decided to let that gas out of my body. No one was around to be disturbed by it, and it was certainly disturbing me as it danced along my colon. So I decided to get rid of it. I pushed a little. I pushed with the same energy as I would lightly tap on my car horn to let the truck in front of me know the light had turned green. Not enough for anything offensive. Nothing happened. I'm embarrassed to say it. I'd honestly prefer you all believe I don't actually pass gas, but when nothing happened, I did the lean. You know what I'm talking about, right? When you're concerned that your gas might be trapped inside your butt cheeks because the way you're sitting is holding them together in a vice death grip, and then you lean over to one cheek to alleviate the butt cheek seal, and then you push again. I loved this. Guys, I lost it. I was like, this is the funniest shit I've ever read. And then after that, she talks about how she had some really nasty diarrhea that was shooting out of her ass like a missile. And I was like, that's hilarious, dude. I love it. I love it. But I think that in writing this, the intention was kind of like, because she tries to connect it to what she's talking about later about the journey of healing after loss, but it's not really clear. Like, I'm totally lost on how that story is supposed to relate to her overall point. I think that, truthfully, the point of that story was to seem relatable, to be like, look, I take nasty butt shits like you do. I'm exactly the same as you. I thought it was like supposed to be humanizing, but I realized that it was essentially curated imperfection. So when Rachel's talking about like her nasty farts and her nasty poop, like, have you guys ever read the book Everyone Poops? Like, everyone poops. Rachel, I already knew that you pooped. Like, it wasn't news to me. That story basically was like, look how raw and real I'm being. but she's being raw and real when it doesn't matter. Talking about your poop, like, sure, maybe there's some people in your audience who are, like, grossed out easily and would be completely like, ew, no, I don't want to hear about your poop, that's gross, and I don't like you anymore because of that or whatever, but it's not really going to alienate your audience. It's not showing a true imperfection. It's not showing a true understanding of mistakes and wrongdoing. The problem with Rachel is that when she tries to show an imperfection, it's an imperfection like, look, I farted and it was gross. Or it's like, I ate some cake and didn't think about the calories. Her imperfection is never, I did this thing that was wrong. I did this intentional thing that was a problem for other people, and I recognize the problem in what I did, and now I would like to say that that is not true of me anymore, and here's how I'm going to fix it. Her imperfections are never things that are ever actually her fault, and that is because for all of this talk about owning your own destiny and taking responsibility for your life, Rachel is utterly incapable of taking responsibility for the things that she's done wrong. Even when she has grown and discovered new things and become more aware of the world around her in a way that's important to the people watching her, she never really admits that she had it wrong in the first place. So, for example, the story about walking around eating cake batter off the mixers and not worrying about the calories, that's great that you're able to do that, but are you ever going to apologize for all the body shaming you did previously? In Girl Wash Your Face, she talked about how Pam was a person we couldn't trust because she ate pizza and cake when she was supposed to be on a Whole30 diet. Now Rachel's over here like, I was free, I ate the cake and didn't worry about the calories. But there's no apology. There's no, I realized that my hyperfixation on being thin and dieting was unnecessary. There was no, I apologized for trying to impose that on other women. Because the truth is, she's not sorry. She still is trying to make money off of a health brand and a health app and an exercise routine app. Someone in my comment section on my recent video that I put out, like, did Rachel join the anti-MLM community? Someone had the quote from Mac from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia that was like, I'm playing both sides so I always come out on top. And that really feels like what she's doing here when she's saying like, I'm gonna be free and eat the cake and not worry about the calories, but then at the same time is like, here is my health app so that you can be skinny like me. She's playing both sides to always come out on top. And in reality, to me, I think it makes her never come out on top because it's not genuine. Just today before I started filming this, BuzzFeed actually put out their review of this book, and there were a couple parts in this that I thought really spoke to what I'm trying to say in this section. So first of all, credit to my source. Her name is Stephanie McNeil. Shout out to Stephanie McNeil for this really well-written review. So in this section, this section of the article right here really illustrated what I was trying to say with the way that her curated imperfection is really shallow because it doesn't actually address the things that she personally has to take responsibility for. So right here in this article it says, Hollis has always been criticized for being out of touch, but it seems even this watershed moment has not led her to undergo any self-reflection on her own privilege or altered her philosophies at all. She also seems to have an inability to do any self-reflection on the breakdown of her marriage, the criticism she has faced because of it, and what it means for her brand. Rather than her divorce being a moment for her to do some reflection on her mistakes and grow, she shoehorns it into the book as just one more example of a hardship to overcome. Rachel's acknowledgments of her own flaws are completely shallow. And that shallow acknowledgement and that inability to reflect on herself and to realize that she is capable of being wrong, even about these big things that built her career, is what leads me into the next section of this review, the incorrect advice. On page 69, Rachel straight up admits to lying about marriage advice. Now, in my video where I broke down Rachel's divorce, I talked a lot about the marriage conference Rise Together that she and Dave hosted, where tickets went from, $800 to almost $2,000 to go to this conference where they did marriage workshops and gave marriage advice. They even outright admitted that they don't have any formal training as marriage counselors. They don't have any license to do this. But the entire idea that drove people to want to come to this conference in the first place was that Rachel and Dave had a really strong marriage. supposedly. They had a really strong marriage is what people thought, a marriage that was working, through huge businesses, through huge shifts, through having lots of kids, and they were making it work and they seemed so happy together. Other people wanted what they had, so they decided to take marriage advice from them. That was disingenuous, and in this chapter, Rachel even admits that she gave inaccurate advice at this conference, but she frames it in a way where she still seems to paint herself as the victim and shows absolutely no remorse for the other people at her conference who had to go away with that incorrect advice that they paid for. When Rachel says, "Girl, stop apologizing," it's become clear to me that not apologizing is not just a quirky phrase anymore to mean, girl, live your dreams, don't be sorry for who you are. She actually is incapable of apologizing. And we've gone over this before when she plagiarized Maya Angelou, and instead of offering an honest apology for a mistake, she blamed someone else who posted the graphic. This is what she does again here. She describes a mistake that she made, but she offers no remorse for it, and she offers no apology to the person who was hurt in the process. Years ago, I was working with a married couple during one of our conferences, and during that conversation, I held my tongue and didn't say what I was really thinking. It was earlier on in my career, and I didn't yet trust my gut or my intuition to speak truthfully, especially with an audience watching this couple process the very painful parts of their relationship so publicly. But I cannot tell you how many times I have thought about that couple over the years and regretted not saying to them what I will say to you now. She admits a regret, but also frames herself as, I wasn't comfortable yet. I was too inexperienced. Well, if you were too inexperienced and too new to this career to be comfortable yet, why were you charging people money to go to marriage conferences? Maybe you should have waited until you felt more confident dealing with any potential situation. She goes on to talk about how the couple had been married for a while and the wife eventually admitted that she cheated on the husband, and how Rachel didn't know how to deal with that situation in the moment. That this couple had gone through therapy, they'd gone through counseling, but the husband had still felt so slighted by the infidelity that had happened years ago that he was still using it kind of as a bargaining chip against his wife. So that is an incredibly complicated situation to be in. I don't think there's any, this person's right, this person's wrong in that situation, and I would not know how to navigate that because I am not a marriage counselor. Only a marriage counselor could navigate that situation because it's going to be different for every couple. For some couples, infidelity is an instant deal breaker and that couple will have no saving and should break up. For other people, there can be some compromise and some ability to move past it and to show the work that you've done. For some people, using something as a bargaining chip is a deal breaker. It depends on those people and their individual values of what makes a relationship important and worthwhile to them. And a counselor could actually sit down and work with that couple and break down each of their motivations and break down the different ways that they communicate with each other and how those types of communication might be affecting each other, to position yourself as a professional who has the answers, and then later get divorced, and then later admit that you actually didn't tell her the right thing back then. And not offer, like, you could say you regret it, but not really offer an apology, not say, I was not qualified to do this work. In the future, I will stop doing work I'm unqualified for. She shows no signs of recognizing that. This couple were having the same painful arguments they'd been having since the initial hurt. No matter what she did to prove to him that she was sorry and would never make the mistake again, he still reserved the right to be just as hurt by it all those years later as he had been originally. And what I knew then with bone-deep clarity was that on some level, even subconsciously, he would stay inside of this deep pain because his hurt was how he punished her for wounding him. You see, if he was angry, she might get angry too, but if he was hurt, if he was wounded and she was the cause, he got to hold it over her head for the rest of their lives. I didn't say this to that couple because the man was too deep inside of his pain to even be aware of what he was doing. I didn't say it that day because on some level it felt inappropriate to tell someone wounded that he was being unfair. I didn't say it that day because she had told the room that she cheated and it felt easier to honor her honesty than defend her right to move on from it. I didn't say what I knew, that it would be impossible for them to ever have a healthy relationship if that dynamic wasn't resolved. I didn't say that to them, though I have prayed many times over the years that someone did. I don't think that this couple paid you $1,500 for thoughts and prayers. They paid you that money for tangible marriage advice for you to help them work through it in that moment. And you didn't. You didn't do it. And you admit it here. On page 73, she had another moment of this inaccurate representation of things that felt a little targeted at me, I'm not gonna lie. So here's what she said. She says, another way that guilt might show up for you inside of or after crisis is the guilt that other people think you are required to carry. It's the man who wants to date again after the loss of his wife but doesn't because his children are angry at him for moving on. It's the girl in college who finally finds the courage to admit who she really is only to be faced with the recriminations offered by her concerned family members. It's the author who's written for years about working on her marriage and the internet bullies who say horrible things when that marriage ends. Rachel, I just want to talk. Like, literally, if that's me you're referring to, send me a message. I'll interview you. I've always respectfully criticized you. And the divorce wasn't your fault, but the fact that you charged people for marriage advice, which you admit was inaccurate on the previous page, that's your fault. So she talks here about how she doesn't read the comments, which I don't really believe anymore. So she's like, I don't read the comments, but somehow they find their way to me through anxious friends and family who seem to think that strangers on the internet might get some say in my life. Strangers on the internet? Those strangers on the internet, Rachel, are the ones who have funded your entire career. It's not fair to have those people be strangers on the internet when they're criticizing something after they had paid you money for your advice and for your expertise only to have it fall flat. If they are a part of your community, you call yourself their friend, their big sister Rach, when you do all of that, then when they turn out to be critical of the advice you gave because it didn't work for them to suddenly be strangers on the internet, that says a lot. She says, sometimes it's specific, like people reaching out and asking for a refund to a women's conference they attended years before due to the fact that I'm a misleading liar and because she thought she was being taught by a God-fearing woman. And since only a sinner contemplates divorce, I rebuke everything you've taught me. So it is very possible that someone said that to her. And if they did, I think that is an unfair criticism that they gave her. And Rachel, I'm sorry that someone said that to you because that is very rude. But to me, it feels a little bit like a straw man. I don't think it's completely a straw man, but I think it's kind of approaching that territory. So let me explain what I mean by that. For those of you who don't know, within an argument, a straw man is a logical fallacy when to make your argument, you create the idea of what you think your opposition is arguing rather than arguing against what they literally said. So I talked about this in my video where I dissected classically Abby in her videos, how when she talked about the Believe Women movement and the Me Too movement, and she said that the reason she doesn't like this movement is because it's trying to get rid of due process and trying to get rid of innocent until proven guilty. And then she broke down why those things are harmful. But the problem is that that's a straw man, because I, a member of the Me Too movement, I personally don't want to get rid of due process either. So her arguing at me and telling me all the reasons that it's important to keep due process, that doesn't change my argument because she argued against something that I didn't ever actually say. What I said was that we should keep due process, but also take women's stories seriously and give them the benefit of the doubt when investigating them. And that's an entirely different argument, but because that's a harder argument to refute, instead, she brings up an argument that wasn't ever actually said. So that's kind of how a straw man works. Now, it's entirely possible that someone really did say this to Rachel, and if they did, in that case, it wouldn't be a straw man, but I don't think it's truly representative of the vast majority of the criticism that she got. The vast majority of the criticism, at least from my perspective, from my video that I made about this, from the things I've said, is not that she's no longer a God-fearing woman or that she has denounced her religion because she contemplated divorce. No, the criticism that we have and why people like me think she should give out refunds is that she sold people on a false narrative. She told people my marriage is perfect because we do these things, and then later said, despite doing all of those things, our marriage still couldn't last because it had too many problems. And that's disingenuous. She sold people on false advertising, essentially. And because of that, I think it is fair for people to ask for a refund. But I also think it's always fair to ask for a refund. Like, I've made a video about being a small business owner adapting to the pandemic, and asking for refunds is a thing you have to do. If someone asked me for a refund, I might tell them no, but I'd still understand why they asked. So the fact is that may be one person's criticism, but to position it as everybody's criticism about why they want to get a refund is, I think, missing the point of what most people were saying, and I think it's intentionally missing the point in favor of having an easier argument to refute by saying, wow, isn't that mean? Look at how this person was bullying me. When in reality, the majority of people were not bullying you, they were criticizing you. And I need to say this. I need to say this loud for everyone to understand. Criticism is not bullying. Criticism and bullying are two completely different things. Criticizing someone is when you look at the actions that they did and the words that they said and the effects that it had on other people, and you talk about why you think the thing they did wasn't the right thing to do. That is criticism. Criticism comes in many forms. Bullying is when you are mean to someone, when you attack them as a person without having anything to back that up, and you attack them as a person and result to insults. I've never insulted Rachel. I don't think I have. If I have, and I'm wrong about that, please let me know in the comments below, and I will apologize, because I don't mean to ever insult her. I mean to criticize her work and criticize the things she said and done, and that is not bullying. If you think allowing yourself any type of criticism is a form of bullying, that is toxic positivity in a nutshell, and that is the problem with this type of movement. And here's the thing. It's not just me who thinks this. We're going back to the BuzzFeed article. Hollis spends less time specifically examining her divorce. Unfortunately for fans who may be eager for the tea, Hollis gives very few details about why exactly she and Dave broke up. Dave has implied on social media it was his wife's decision to split. Dave, who's also an influencer and published his first self-help book this year, is also working on his next book. Oh God. I have more reviews coming, I guess. After the announcement of their split, the couple was immediately criticized for positioning themselves for years as marriage gurus without any actual credentials and for hosting relationship counseling conferences, which cost $798 a person for early bird pricing, when their own union was apparently crumbling behind the scenes. Many fans asked how they were supposed to trust the advice of a woman who is unwilling to be vulnerable and honest about her own circumstances. Bloggers who reacted to the news wrote that while they didn't judge the couple for the divorce, they did judge how the couple had portrayed themselves. So this is the actual criticisms that Rachel is getting. And maybe she did get that one criticism she brought up, but she is completely ignoring these very valid criticisms, such as, we're talking about two very influential life coaches who rapidly built an empire on tough love and being supposedly open books, yet they've been covering up the real state of their own marriage for years, blogger Shannon Ashley writes on Medium. As Ashley writes, how can someone trust the guidance of a self-help guru who, as people online claim, isn't being real with them? The absence of vulnerability is a significant problem with the Hollis brand and many other lifestyle bloggers who become life coaches, she writes. Dave and Rachel clearly want us to think they're being vulnerable when they typically haven't said anything of substance. Liz Faria, a licensed social worker, check that out, licensed, we love it, who blogs at A Mothership Down, writes that she believes the backlash was so severe against the couple because they have been profiting off of the vision that their marriage is one to emulate. People have been following this couple and wishing that their own marriage was more like the marriage between Rachel and Dave, she writes. This kind of fictional narrative presented as reality is harmful to followers who will never feel like their own lives are good enough because they aren't as perfect as what they see from influencers online. And now that Rachel and Dave are getting a divorce, these followers are angry because they rightfully feel like they've been duped. Look at that! It wasn't that people thought she wasn't a good Christian anymore because she contemplated divorce. It was legitimate criticism the whole time, just like I suggested. That is not the biggest deal in this book. The biggest deal is this entire chapter called Show Up. This whole chapter is a problem. So the chapter Show Up starts on page 119, and it is all about showing up for the other people in your life during times of tragedy. Rachel attempts in this chapter to give parents advice about how to be a parent during times of tragedy, and it's clear that her advice is misinformed because multiple licensed therapists have come out and said what she said was completely inaccurate. And not only was her advice completely inaccurate, it's anecdotal to the point of her projecting things she's still bitter about from her own life and using that as fuel to give advice to other people. That can't be healthy, but I'm not a therapist, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. So let's head to page 128. I was talking to an acquaintance recently who was going through an awful divorce, and she's been a self-confessed emotional wreck for months because of it. I was asking how her daughters, a senior in high school and freshman in college, were handling everything, and she told me, they're so great, so strong. I mean, they've had to hear so much from me, probably heard more and seen more than they should have, but they're old enough to know the truth. They can handle it. And then Rachel says, nope. I'll tell you what I told her that day. Your kids are never old enough to watch you have a breakdown. Your kids are never, ever old enough for you, the parent, to process your pain, grief, fear, and anxieties with them. Never. It's not your child's job to hold space for you to fall apart. Call your therapist, your priest, your rabbi, or your best friend, but don't you dare ask your kids to carry you through a hard season. It is your job to be strong for them, even if you have to fake it. That's what you signed up for. Now, throughout this chapter, Rachel talks about an example of parents who did this badly. And of course, they're her own parents. Rachel has shit-talked her own parents so many times. We even talked about in Girl Stop Apologizing how utterly rude she was to her mom and how she shows no ability to self-reflect and realize that her mom probably had her own side of the story on all of this. Throughout this, Rachel talks about probably the most difficult thing she's ever gone through in her life, and I want to be clear, I'm going to talk about this further, but I do respect Rachel a lot for opening up about her brother's death and about finding her brother's dead body and about the effect and the emotional impact that it had on her. I don't wish that on anybody. That is one of the most difficult and horrible things a person can go through. And since this happened to her when she was so young, I see how this shaped a lot of the way she saw the world. But the fact is, going through something difficult like that doesn't give you the authority to tell other people the one right way to go through something like that, especially when, as we will look at, multiple therapists have told her that that is inaccurate. So throughout this chapter, she talks about how right after her older brother died, her parents stopped really paying much attention to Rachel, which is terrible. I feel bad that she had to go through that, but she talks about how they regularly broke down about their sadness over her brother's death in front of her, and about how they kind of stopped being a parent to her or taking as much of an active role in her life because they were so broken. And I imagine for Rachel, that must have been really difficult to live with. I know that having to fight for your parents' attention is hard, and I'm very fortunate to have grown up with a mom who's been incredibly involved in my life from day one and who has always been there for me, no questions asked. I'm grateful for that, truly. And I do honestly feel for Rachel that she didn't get to have that experience. But the fact that that situation was painful for her does not mean that she can draw this blanket statement that every parent should not process emotions in front of their kids and should have to fake it being strong for them. Especially because we're going to take a look. Multiple therapists have responded to her and told her that this was incorrect. So on the day of the book's release, Rachel posted on Instagram on her Let's Rise page saying, "Your kids are never old enough to watch you have a breakdown." So she posted that quote from her book. Let's read what some people on Instagram, including experts, had to say about this. So someone said, "Is there a follow-up to this quote I'm missing? Because 100% no. As a therapist, one that treats children and adults, this is not true. And sometimes hiding your breakdowns is the worst things they can see. Emotionally depending on your children is not okay, but processing pain together is necessary. Do you know that I've had adults in their 40s and 50s ask their parents to come with them to therapy to process them hiding the hardship from them and making them feel like they can't break down? Like, often have this happen?" This therapist was saying, okay, you're right about, like, you shouldn't have your kid turn into your therapist. You shouldn't be the person who relies on them, but you should process the pain together. You should be open and honest with one another about your emotions. Rachel literally says in this chapter, even if you have to fake it. This person is saying, no, we're not going to fake it. It's important to process your real emotions together, to work through tragedy together as a family. I trust this person more than Rachel because this person's a real therapist. So this other person says, as a therapist, this is so toxic and the root of why so many of my clients have trust issues. You should absolutely show your authentic emotions to your child. It's called lead by example. Don't you want your child to feel they're allowed to show their emotions? So basically, Rachel was just wrong about this. And I'm not surprised considering her entire basis for this had nothing to do with actual roots in psychology or therapy or theories about how human brains process emotions. emotions, but her basis for this was what she's still bitter about her parents having done to her. Okay, Rachel, if you want anecdotal evidence, I'll give you anecdotal evidence for why I'm wrong. I'm not a therapist, guys, but I would say you should process your emotions with your kids, because growing up, I came from I both lived with a single parent for a while. I came from a blended family after that, after I was adopted on my dad's side, and my family had issues adjusting. They're great people. Every single person in my family I love with my full heart, and I don't blame a single person for anything that ever went wrong. I blame circumstances. But the fact is, sometimes things were hidden from me, but I could tell that there was, even when my parents tried to hide a difficult emotional situation that was going on within our family's transitions to me, I could still feel that there was some kind of tension there. There was tension you could cut with a knife, even if they faked it, even if they hid it. And I thought that as a kid, I wish that I was able to process things with them, but the fact that they had tried to hide that there was something going on beneath the surface was the opposite of helpful to me, because it constantly made me feel like I know something going on is wrong and I want to be able to help. I'm seeing people I love pretending they're not suffering when I know deep down that they are, and I want to be able to help them, because our natural inclination as empathetic humans is to want to help the people that we love. So there's my anecdotal evidence on why the opposite of what you're saying is true. Neither of us are licensed to give that advice, so I'm just going to listen to the therapist instead, okay? On page 131, she says, never let them see you run. And at the beginning of this section, she gives an example that's legitimate based on actual experience that she legitimately has. So Rachel used to be a party planner and a wedding planner and that kind of thing. And I would honestly love to know more about her days doing that and how she got clients and her advice with that, because I'm much more interested in that than all this self-help bullshit. But she talks about, I always told my team, no matter what is happening, never let the guests see you running. And her reason for that is that, like, if you're at a wedding and you see someone running around in the background doing things, that it's distracting from the event, and it might make the guests at that event worried that something is going wrong. And you don't want to put that stress on the guests at your event, because you're the people hired to work there. I agree. In party planning, I think that's exactly true. But guess what? Party planning and parenting are two different things. You can't, like, she's doing this thing where she's like, I learned this and then I applied it to parenting. But not every idea from one thing applies to an entirely different situation. That doesn't make sense. So she says, your children should never know you're stressed out. If you're worried, you need to protect them from that. If you're having a hard day, go into your room and have a good cry or a glass of wine or scream into a pillow. If you are grieving, still make them pancakes. Do not let your kids see that you're struggling. All these therapists have said, that's wrong. Don't do that. Don't hide your emotions from your kids, because then you're going to set the example for them that hiding their emotions is what they need to do. Instead, be open about your emotions with them. But she's just giving unlicensed advice. That's just wrong. You can let your kids see you being stressed out. And if you're worried, still make them pancake. What? Like, even if you're a parent, you're still your own person. You're just because you had a kid, like, sure, you need to put them first, but that doesn't mean that your entire being has to take a back seat to someone else. Also, throughout this book, Rachel literally talks about, like, how when stressful situations come up, you need to build those good habits so you don't resort to drinking or something. But then literally here she says, have a glass of wine. I don't get why Rachel, her advice about drinking is constantly all over the place, and I just wouldn't trust it regardless. Wow, was that a lot to talk about? Let's talk about one final huge area that I had a problem with in this book, which was the disrespect of small businesses. When I did a reaction to Rachel's speech at the doTERRA Essential Oils Multi-Level Marketing Conference, I flew off the handle being angry about how she claimed that doTERRA representatives were small business owners, and small business owners are the backbone of America. Rachel has a weird relationship with the term small business owner in that she uses it incorrectly and allows it to be appropriated for a pyramid scheme type of selling and network marketing. In this book, thankfully, like I said in my video that I put out on Tuesday, she does not promote multi-level marketing in this book and actually says that it's not a good idea. But there are multiple places in this book where she continues to show disrespect to the concept of actual small businesses, but then says she's an advocate for them when it's convenient for her. Let's look at a few examples. On page 36, she says, I was a mother of 2 young sons, a wife, and a small business owner, and I was deeply unhappy. The problem wasn't the life I had chosen. The problem was I realized I was made for more than the life I had chosen. but I also understood that the people around me wouldn't like for me to change. So you're saying being a small business owner is beneath you? She's like, I'm a small business owner, but I was made for more than that. Like, I'm a small business owner, and y'all, hashtag savvy business owner addresses this. I'm plugging myself real quick. Rachel, you plugged yourself. I can do the same thing. Chapter 14 in hashtag savvy business owner is called To Scale or Not to Scale. And in this, right here, there's a section called Is Scaling Always the Answer? Where we talk about, does your small business need to grow? Does it need to become a big business? And right here I say, if you want to start a neighborhood restaurant, your business might need to scale once as you grow your customer base and save money to buy cheaper ingredients in bulk. But that doesn't mean you need to turn your restaurant into a chain with multiple locations. You can if you want to, but it's not required. Not all small businesses have to become big businesses. And then I even do it with some exclamation points. Not all small businesses have to become big businesses. I almost feel like I need the clap emoji for emphasis. I think, and then continue saying, I think there's a stigma in the business world that we should always have growth as our number one priority. While the growth mindset is good for keeping yourself motivated, there's no requirement that growth be your focus. If you want to run a small business, run a small business. Don't let anyone tell you your business needs to expand if it doesn't. So Rachel's over here like, I was made for more than being a small business owner. And that's insulting. I'm a small business owner and I don't feel like I'm less than you because my business employs fewer people or brings in less yearly revenue than yours does. That doesn't make me less. It doesn't mean, oh, you're made for more than being a small business owner. Fuck off with that. And then she says, instead, I lived with debilitating anxiety and played the role that made everyone else feel most comfortable, even if I was miserable. And so I was like, what were you miserable about? You were miserable about owning a small business because you were like, I was destined to own a big business. And everyone around me was trying to keep me down by saying, you should only own a small business. Maybe that's not what she meant by this, but like, you could have clarified, Rachel, because as a small business owner, I am highly offended. Page 93 is both an example of being tone deaf and of dissing small business owners. We love to see it. So she's talking about quarantine here. She says, instead of thinking of the quarantine as something bad that I had to endure, I challenged myself to ask how the opposite could be true, and it hit me right between the eyes. Quarantine is a privilege. So I commented right here, said, not for small business owners. Because actually that's three things. That's being tone deaf. That's some toxic positivity with like, instead I needed to turn the quarantine into a positive. And she's over here saying quarantine is a privilege. It's not a privilege for me. It's not a privilege for me where all of my events got shut down, where I had to sever a relationship with my bulk printer, where I had to cancel events that I'd planned for the entire year, where all of my plans for starting deals with brick and mortar stores for my books and plushies had to get put on hold for an entire year. That's not a privilege. That's an obstacle. And then she goes on to talk about how like her quarantine was a privilege because she doesn't have to be an essential worker. But then I'm like, how is that going to help your audience members who are essential workers who still do have to go out into the virus and work at a hospital or something? Then on page 136, Rachel did what she loves to do, which is to suddenly flip the script and pretend that she felt a certain way all along when she says, during the quarantine we experienced from COVID-19, we small business owners felt this keenly. So at the beginning of the book, being a small business owner wasn't enough for you. It was the role society placed on you, and you were made for more and destined for greater things than being a small business owner. But now you're part of us? Now you're one of us? Now you're we small business owners? What the fuck, Rachel? What is this? What is this? I don't know. I circled we because I was like, oh, you diss us and now you're one of us? Rachel, are you a small business owner or not? Because if you want to claim that you're a small business owner, I need you to fuck off with that whole, I was made for more than my tiny little small business. You either support small businesses or you don't. Now that I've yelled so much my voice is almost gone, let's talk about a few things that I liked. I did like that Rachel cited some experts in this book. I appreciate that based on when I read books like Girl Stop Apologizing, she seemed to just pretend that all of these ideas were her own, but in this book she did draw on some expert knowledge. On page 47, she says, when my brother died, I heard about the stages of grief for the first time. Psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross coined the term back in the 60s, and the model is still used today. And then from there, she goes on to break down what the cycle of grief is about. And then she continues to use Dr. Kubler-Ross and discuss her ideas and Rachel's own relationship to those ideas. So she did bring in an expert and talked about the person who actually created this idea. And I love to see it, Rachel. I want to see more of it in the future. On page 172, she brings in ideas and cites an actual neuroscientist when talking about how things work in our brain. And I appreciated that so much. So she says, back in the 1960s, a neuroscientist named Paul D. MacLean formulated a model for something called the triune brain theory. And then she broke down how his triune brain theory, how it meant that certain parts of our brain have a fight or flight response, and how that leads to the way that people naturally react to certain situations above others. So she used actual expert knowledge and applied it to the point she was making. Now, Rachel has set the bar so incredibly low for herself with Girl Stop Apologizing that I actually have to say a thing I liked was that she gave credit for some quotes. That should be the absolute bare minimum, but the bar for her is below the ground. It's deep in the ocean. Page 109, she says that Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear." And good for you, because, you know, she was plagiarizing like John F. Kennedy, and she was plagiarizing every single person of all time in Girl Stop Apologizing. But this time she gave credit for, quote, good work. On page 149, she says that to get financial advice, she recommends looking at Dave Ramsey and all of his resources that are available online. And I was like, good for you for recommending someone else. However, I'm pretty sure in Girl Stop Apologizing you plagiarized Dave Ramsey. So I don't know how much of a success that really is. However, I will say one other thing was done well in this book, and that's that she did give some good business advice and financial advice. And that is on page 145. So as a business owner, I endorse this advice that she's given right here. So she's talking about when she worked as a party planner, and in 2008, the economy crashed, and suddenly a lot of people had a lot less money to be hosting events. She was working with high-end clients who were doing huge, extravagant gatherings, and people just didn't have money for those anymore. So she was worried her business was going to struggle. So here's what she did. She said, first I figured out who absolutely had to have events, and they became my new favorite customers. Before everything went south, my business had been primarily supported by large-scale corporate events for the entertainment industry, but those were instantly gone. But there were some businesses that still needed events, and I fought tooth and nail to land them as customers. Weddings still happened, even if they weren't on the same scale as before. I leaned heavily into wedding planning, even though I honestly hated the work because most brides in Los Angeles were awful. That's kind of a sexist generalization. I'm not a fan, but you know what? I have only been to Los Angeles once, and it was never to plan a wedding, so I'll take your word for it. So she says, the companies that still needed events were nonprofits, since many of them used their annual gala as the fundraiser that would keep them in business. I learned everything I could about fundraising and silent auctions and turned that into a new line of business for us too. The irony, of course, is that both the wedding planning and my work in the nonprofit sector ended up becoming the bedrock of my business long after the economy was healthy again. I love that! More of that, Rachel! First of all, I just wish she'd talk more about what she learned as a party planner and her time with that, because, I do event stuff for Forever Home Friends, not right now because we're in quarantine, but the advice she said there, I found, the similar thing to be true. So, for me with Forever Home Friends, the staple of my business was going to conventions, festivals, art fairs, those kind of things, and selling. I had to shift. I did have an online store, but online sales were not the majority of how I made money. So when the quarantine hit and all of my events got canceled, I had to shift my focus to online. So I decided to hit the internet heavily. I decided to expand my YouTube channel. I decided to hire a social media manager to work on my Instagram. And because of that, now my online presence is growing more and more, and that's becoming a staple of my business. And now when the virus, hopefully eventually we get a vaccine for it and the events can happen again one day in the future, when that happens, I will now have a stronger online component and still my events component. And I talked about this. I'll link the video where I detailed how I adapted my business to the pandemic up in the cards. But what she's saying there, I have found to be so true, and I think that advice could be so useful for a lot of people. So as a business owner, I endorse page 145 of this book. And finally, the last thing was the writing in her final chapter. Honestly, Rachel, I've talked in the past about how she's really good at writing women's fiction and romance, and I wish she'd write more of it. But if she really wants to talk about her own personal experiences and how they shaped her, she should write memoir. She's really not qualified to write self-help. These self-help books the advice is shallow, and when she does try to give specific advice, it often ends up being wrong because she's just not an expert in these things. If she shifted toward writing memoir, where the focus is not, here's what you should do, but rather, here's the things I experienced, let me paint a picture for you as a nonfiction story for you to go into, but also to maybe learn something about the experiences of another person, she would be so much better with that. She writes this chapter at the end of the book where she opens up about what happened when her brother died when she was 14. And honestly, I almost cried reading this chapter. Like, Rachel, I think this chapter was a beautiful tribute to him. And if you're watching this, I am really sorry that you had to see that and you had to deal with that. That's a horrible thing. And when she talks about, having gone to a lot of funerals, I came from a Polish Catholic family, and we all gather for everyone's funeral, just like what she's talking about here. And I understood what she was talking about, and the emotions came through. And Rachel, what you wrote here was beautiful. This final chapter called Hold On to Hope. Everything in this talking about how you felt in the moment and your thought process and what it meant to you, that's memoir right there. And it's beautiful, and you have a real skill for it. So that's my best advice. Write a memoir. There's clearly a lot from your childhood you're still processing, and I feel the same way. I didn't have a great childhood, and that's no shade to anyone in my life. I've talked many times about, my mom and I work in business together. She designs the stuffed animals for my company. And I love my family. They're fantastic people. I had a shitty childhood, and it wasn't anyone's fault. It was due to circumstances that were outside of our control, and also due to the fact that I have a lot of health problems. And I understand where you're coming from with this, and I understand the difficulty in processing all of that. But I think where you really shine is when you can tell us a narrative rather than when you can give us vapid advice that doesn't mean anything. So, Rachel, if you take anything away from this review, write more memoir. You're good at it. I know this was a long-ass video, but those were pretty much my thoughts on Rachel Hollis's Didn't See That Coming. If you want to know my thoughts on, the anti-MLM stuff, I did another video, which you guys probably saw, that I posted on Tuesday, about how the one thing I legitimately didn't see coming was her denouncing MLMs and saying that they're not a smart financial decision. But she was also victim blaming in that section where she refused to take responsibility for the fact that she had actually encouraged people to do that in the first place. This video is getting way too long. It's time for me to go and edit this. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you liked this video, please stick around on this channel at 12:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern. I am going to be live streaming here and writing my novel Live Cancel Sean Boston with my friend RK. I hope you guys enjoy that. Thank you for being here. Please give this video a like, please subscribe, and in the meantime, friends, until I see you again, please don't forget to support small businesses. Happy Friday.
Get you some nuts.
There was lots of memes.
Makes me wonder if I should take up lesbianism.
Chicago.
You guys asked for it.